A new year calls for new resolutions, such as exiting Vim on the first try, remembering which git, rebase, reset, or revert is useful, securing your supply chain, and subscribing to ASW. Of course, only one of those is actually achievable, which means this week we talk about security by design and whether the AppSec community has created useful resources for DevOps teams to understand what that's supposed to mean. In the news segment, Microsoft resolves its SolarWinds exposure and shares a threat model. Apple resolves some settings for personal threat models. Firefox resolves to tackle abuse of storage side channels. We check up on resolutions in 2 articles from 1 year ago, and more. Set some goals and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Security teams need visibility into Linux systems to detect and investigate incidents and protect against unwanted activity. Operations teams are not down with downtime, and with revenue tied to uptime, ops priorities are enterprise priorities. Which is a higher priority? Why not both? Capsulate provides flexible, production-ready infrastructure protection for Linux systems, all without a kernel module. With ops-friendly production security, Capsulate delivers monitoring, detection, and response without adding operational risk or cost. Visit securityweekly.com/capsulate today to request a demo. In a fast-paced tech environment, the potential attack surface increases with each release and new app created. Detectify automates cutting-edge knowledge from trusted ethical hackers into the development pipeline for reliable application security. Go beyond the OWASP Top 10. Check your web apps for over 2,000 known vulnerabilities actively exploited in the wild, monitor subdomains for potential takeovers, and remediate security issues in staging and production. Learn more with a free trial at securityweekly.com/detectify. Go hack yourself.
This is episode 135, recorded January 4th, 2021. Whew, we made it. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with John Kinsella. Happy New Year, John.
Happy New Year! Oh my God, I survived 2020. So I'm looking forward to our discussion here today about Hair Talk Weekly.
Hair Talk Weekly, Horror Movie Weekly, and a little bit of Synthwave. And I suppose we'll maybe squeeze in a little bit of security as well. Let's see. Pokemon. Oh, we got to do all the topics. Do you want to stay in the loop on all things Security Weekly, including Pokemon, Synthwave, and hairs and hats? Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe on your favorite podcast catcher or our YouTube channel. Sign up for our mailing list and join our Discord server. Since, of course, you can't join us on Slack because Slack is down today. So 2021 starting off on fun for everyone. We have officially wrapped up all of the recordings for our 2020 webcasts and technical trainings. Stay tuned as we build out some of our schedule for this new year. Visit securityweekly.com/on-demand to view all of our 2020 recordings. And with that fun and announcements out of the way, it's time to talk about something application security-wise there, John. I was thinking that last year, which was 2020, trying to keep my years straight, we kicked it off by discussing privacy by design. And actually, we went through a couple principles that had been, that some groups had documented about what does it mean to have privacy by design. I thought we could do the same thing with security by design for this year, but then I kind of ran into some problems about finding good resources about what, in fact, does that actually mean. So I figured we could sort of help our listeners out on that by shedding some light on this topic and go through some OWASP resources and figure out what's relevant and maybe what's missing and what we can fill in. So I'll just start off with, saying, there's the OWASP Top 10, but let's kind of skip over that because I don't know that that's really something by design other than just threats and problems. There is the end. Once you have something designed, you can do some web security testing guides. So that's another OWASP resource. And it does talk a little bit about threat modeling. And then, of course, there is the OWASP Application Security Verification Standard, which is sort of verifying, did you actually design something secure? So I don't know, between the OWASP Top 10, Web Security Testing Guide, ASVS, is one of those three something that has stood out to you as that sort of useful resource you point to when we talk about, hey, developers, we're shifting left the responsibility onto you?
Honestly, personally, no. And I'll explain why and how I go about that. So for me, I think ASVS is really great. We've talked about that length in the past, probably not enough, but and I don't think we need to rehash top 10. Well, I know there's always an interest in people love talking about OWASP top 10, but I think that's pretty well known.
Yeah.
And the reason I say no, though, is when I engage with developers to say, let's sort of focus on security. The approach that I take, and it's probably partially my both communication style, management style, architectural style, pick your style, care style. But the way I think about this, the way I engage people, is to actually sort of have a bit more of a conversation. I want them to think. So I might drop a few seeds about things that I want them to think about, but I really want to try and prompt them to go and do some of that research themselves. I'm not trying to send someone on a homework problem that's going to take them a week or two to do, right? So what my preference is to do is do a little bit more of that threat landscaping and sort of think about the problem from a high level, then pick a single piece of it, and from that, let's go and figure out what's the best way to do that. And then once people sort of get a sense, in my experience, once people get a sense for doing that in a particular area, they usually they realize, A, oh my God, this isn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. Possibly B, that's sort of fun. Definitely C, hey, I just learned something, and that usually sort of lights people in general, right? Unless you're really under a deadline. So I like taking a little more approach like that with it. I think, like I said, top 10 and ASVS are really useful, really handy. But I think at least when you're first sort of going down this path of a developer saying, okay, how do I secure something? I like to sort of throw a little more breadcrumbs out there and let them sort of dig in and find what interests them, and then take that interest and sort of leverage and run with that.
I think I like that answer, because I think you sort of stole a lot of what I would have said too. For me, the ASVS, I'll pick out basically 3 bullet points, and I think you could kind of end there. And those bullet points would be right at the very beginning, 1.1.2, which is use threat modeling, basically. And it's saying that, the ASVS says use threat modeling for every design change or sprint planning. I would pull that back a little bit and sort of twist it around to how you were describing it and saying, developers, what are you thinking about your application? And just sort of opening that up and getting them to think. But so there's some threat modeling. There's another bullet point about verify the user stories or the features have security constraints, meaning what are users supposed to do, and either hopefully implicitly or explicitly some statements about what should they not do. And then have some documentation or some design around where are the trust boundaries. And after those 3 bullet points, I would almost be done with the ASVS and then just turn to sort of what you were saying. What's the context of what you're building? And I realize this sort of leaves a lot of perhaps our listeners, in the lurch, so to speak, with a sense of, well, great, what framework do I use? What checklist? Like, how do I know that it is built securely? And I think we're both saying that let's not actually go for those checklists. That they're possibly misleading. The top 10, let's just skip over it, and or perhaps let's step back and say, what if we took the OWASP top 10 talking about cross-site scripting, and we turned that into what's a secure by design exercise for cross-site scripting? Should we go through and talk about input validation? Don't think so. Maybe we should talk about something about what's the context. Are we talking to our front end developers? Are we talking to back end developers? Are we talking to our mobile app developers? Maybe, we can basically, what I'm getting to is, where do we bring the context of what the application is being built? What are the developers doing? And the developers aren't ignorant of security. They just need to be perhaps brought around to that security-minded thinking to realize that, these feature boundaries or these trust boundaries are security principles that we should be talking about. And so that's, for me, is where security by design comes from. But it definitely puts a lot of burden, I think, how you said it at the beginning, on leading that discussion. And what are those skills then to lead a discussion? So let me turn this back around to an interview on you, John, and say, yes, exactly. What are some of the skills that you find most useful to lead those discussions then, as you're trying to get developers to sort of, as you said, maybe think for themselves or go down that security-minded thinking?
Yeah, perfect lead in. Because where I want to go with what you're just talking about, and the reason that I sort of take about the reason I'm going down this path. So checklists are super useful. When, at least for me, when I'm developing, when I'm being creative, that's how would I say? That is, it's not something I'm doing in a formulaic checkbox 1, checkbox 2, checkbox 3. So that's why I'm sort of thinking that in itself isn't really useful at that particular point in time. When it comes time to review the code or to sort of move the architecture along a little bit further and sort of go down the path of improving maturity, increasing maturity, I think at that point then the checklists become really useful, really interesting. And I mean, a lot of these were designed. I mean, the OWASP stuff was, I think, in large part designed also from a code review and a pen tester's point of view too, right? So, if I'm doing a review, I want to be able to have a very repetitive process of how I'm going through and doing that, check to make sure everything was done right. But back to your wonderful question, which was prompting me there, and back to the way I was just discussing this when I said about how do I actually engage with individuals or teams. One of the big takeaways for me over the last 18 months, I'd say, is, and I'm always forgetting the book, so I'll see if I can find it before the end of the segment. But the concept of actually, when I engage with people, how do people learn? How do people communicate? How do people engage back with me? And I think this is a really interesting skill for a security person to have in general. If you're going out and talking to, I think, Mike, you said something really interesting there about, and it's almost a separate matrix of what am I seeing? Depending on the type of vulnerability that I'm either trying to fix or ensure that I don't have in my code, which person do I go talk to? Do I talk to the UI guy, the database guy, the mobile guy, the backend guy, the Kubernetes guy? Who do we talk to within our organization, depending on which? So I think that's one thing that's interesting to think about. But the second aspect of it there is when I'm engaging with that person, how do they learn, right? And this is becoming a personality type question, which is the takeaway. My wife first encountered this back at her previous company, I think at SAP, the concept of having the folks in your team take maybe a personality test. It doesn't have to be like psychology driven or psychologist driven, big expensive thing. Go and find something online and figure out who learns by reading, who learns by doing, who communicates in words, who communicates in pictures. I mean, if you look at us over the last year here on ASW, and what triggered me was I was looking at ASVS at 68 pages. Personally, yeah. if I have to read 68 pages, I'm going to go find anything else to do. If you give me charts and graphs, like you'll see me, like when we have these reports, GitLab pops to mind, but all these different ones, I zoom straight in on the graphs. I'm very visual. But if you can figure out how to communicate with those people in a way that makes sense to them, I think you're greasing those slides and you're getting off to a good start. So that's the type of thing I like to do. If we're doing something like, let's stick with the cross-site scripting example, would it make sense to maybe talk through an example or two on a whiteboard or, nowadays on a Zoom board or some sort of, online whiteboarding type thing? Or would it make sense to maybe send them to a definition in text of what is a cross-site scripting and let them read that and think about it? So, I mean, I think that's one of the earlier things I think about in that process is how do I engage with that person? How do I make it both entertaining and efficient and not directly monetarily profitable, but profitable for them to engage back with me. So that's how I think about that type of thing.
Yeah, I think what you're getting at here too is that I think it also ties into if you're building an application security program or even an application security team, what are the roles within that team? Do you want the role of the team to be primarily pen testing after the fact? We're going through the checklist saying, are you vulnerable to XSS? Are you vulnerable to CSRF? Are you vulnerable to some other fancy acronym or some other jargon that basically is very specific, quite honestly, just to application security that no one else really cares about other than understanding, there is a flaw here that either exposes data or breaks one of the CIA triads, confidentiality, integrity, availability. Or perhaps, as I think what you were just describing right now, do you have the role of educator, awareness, or enabler, if you will, of basically guiding that threat modeling discussion. And I'm very deliberately want to take an editorial stance and not call that sort of a soft skill, because I think that has an implication that it's not important, or it's less important than programming. But it's more of those interpersonal communication skills are, in fact, I think, very important for building up that security relationship with DevOps to make security a meaningful part of that collaboration in the development process. And some of what you're describing too is what I think would be great to see is OWASP, or let's call it, I'm picking on OWASP a little bit just because they have some great resources. They put a lot of effort into building these resources. But I think we can expand beyond just computer security or just computers themselves, information technology, into other domains. Talk about a little bit of what is the psychology of education. Do you explain something, then demonstrate, guide somebody through a topic? So with XSS, describe why is this a problem? Demonstrate pop up that alert, and then guide them through on both how to do it, because honestly, it's a little bit fun to pull off some of these hacks, as well as then explain what are some good ways, or don't explain how to fix it, but guide them through the thought process of what would be some good ways to fix it. And here is where, for those of you listening with your bingo cards, I will mention my favorite go-to example, React. Do you want to go through the absolute pain of trying to figure out the CSP level 1, 2, or 3 directives and deploy those policy headers on your website? Or do you want to, obviously there's difficulties here, do you want to go through and deploy just a front end that is something like React, that's just more resilient out of the gate to cross-site scripting? So I think that's where I would start to turn this discussion of security by design, in the sense of, what are your tools, technology that you can build with, and where are you having those conversations?
Yeah, I'm still sort of digging through that. You said a lot there.
I can keep
and
going.
That's we have 15 minutes to go.
We've
12.
got time to fill.
Yeah, and I think, man, I'm trying to gather my thoughts. I had one there, and someone mentioned something on Discord. I think part of the path what you're going down, and actually I want to go a slightly different direction there. Back to talking about what I was saying, and how to, but for both of this, because I think what's interesting in this podcast in general for folks listening, Mike's head of security for a product. I'm nowadays chief architect for a security product. We tend to be relatively senior people in the stack, right? So we tend to say, this is how security should be designed. And I'm actually coding a lot nowadays. I'm not sure, Mike, if you are or not to put you on the spot, but so we tend to be sort of having this higher level look at the security landscape, and then sort of drawing with our brush, so to speak. And I bet the answers to these questions that we're talking about today would be a lot different if we had one of the staff coders that we work with, how they actually think about this. And that could be interesting to sort of find some of those folks and bring them on here in the future. But the advanced answer on top of what I was just talking about there before, how do we communicate, how do we bring these things to people, is if I'm trying to mentor my team and actually grow those people as people besides just security, right? As you were saying, Mike, this isn't purely just around coding or security. How can I, and this was triggered when you were talking about showing them an example of XSS being exploited. How can I get those people to not just think about how to fix it, but to be able to communicate it to someone else? So, and the reason I say this is frequently what I found, and back to college classes and stuff, is if you're able to tutor someone else on a subject and actually explain it, the process of figuring out how to explain something in your head to someone else, sort of like what we're doing here, helps you learn it better, right? So if we can either get them to do maybe demo days, right, when your sprint's done, and say, hey, we fixed this cross-site scripting thing, here's what it looked like before we fixed it, and actually show the exploit to the rest of the team. And then on top of that, here's how we fixed it, and this is what the result is. So I think if we can take it that little step further and give, I know that takes a little more maturity, takes the time to have that process in place and be able to do demo days and things like that. We're all going, I know, 110 miles an hour, but I think that actually sort of helps grow the whole team. So that's something else to think about as well.
It is something good to think about, and you're also highlighting another aspect too. You're saying you're doing quite a bit more programming on a day-to-day basis now. I have astutely avoided it, except for some fun stuff on my own. But never shall any of my code touch a production system anytime soon, simply because those skills are a bit rusty. But what I've been trying to do is go down the path that you were kind of alluding to there about sort of that idea of communication. How do we explain? How do we teach? And it's not the idea of, and here I'm going to be a little bit mean to OWASP Top 10. It's not just saying we want awareness. And if everybody knows about OWASP Top 10 and we bring more awareness about cross-site scripting, it will go away. Doesn't happen. We still have cross-site scripting. But if, one of the things that I've been trying to do over the past year throughout 2020 on the podcast is find what are good write-ups of when somebody finds a vuln and they explain their thought process. What are interesting reports that we see that have the pretty pictures that get John's attention, but that actually have graphs that are conveying something about, here is an interesting question. Here's some data that supports that question. And here's a visualization that actually, that presents the information in a pretty easy way to understand, meaning that could you even strip away a lot of the text and get a sense of what this graphic is trying to say? And I think that's one of the things that is something that is just like programming, it is writing. Programming is writing. We all make mistakes, therefore we have flaws. Writing also has flaws, as those little red squiggles underneath your grammar checking or misspellings are going to point out. But that's a great thing to exercise, and so that's one of the things that I'll just throw out to our listeners that are in Discord already. But those of you listening already, what are some communication skills that you would like to learn more about, or problems that you've run into, as well as what are good examples you've seen of write-ups or presentations? And we'd love to actually highlight a lot more of those on the podcast here.
That's a really great. I like the way you described that there, especially at the end, because one thing, I'll frequently, if I'm watching talks, there's a few interesting ones recently. Nothing to come to the top of my brain. But when I'm watching a good speaker, or if I'm looking to find a good speaker to watch, right, on a conference, frequently I'm taking mental notes about, hey, how can I become better? How can I be a better communicator? Use slides better. Get my point across in an interesting way that entertains the audience and keeps them learning. So I think that's it's a lot more powerful than a lot of us might realize. And then the second analogy you're making me think of there from my woodworking background, there's a pretty common, I listen to a lot of fine woodworking's podcast, and something they mention fairly frequently, right, is like, you don't just, unless we're a professional woodworker, we don't just wander down into the shop and start cutting perfect dovetails. For people who need to, imagine that, you can go and Google around what a dovetail looks like and how those things fit together. It's actually fairly difficult to do. But most of the people who are good but are doing this still part-time or as a hobby, you practice cutting dovetails, right, to get those pieces to fit together really nicely so there's no gap and all that type of thing. And how often do we practice coding, or how often do we practice secure coding? Penetration testing and some of the testing I think is a little bit easier. I'm known for jiggling locks as I wander around in cities and stuff. But when's the last time that I sat down and decided to, let me practice writing a good HTTP handler that's going to, we don't do that. So maybe that means we need to be doing some more open source projects in our spare time, or something to sort of, do a little more than just the day job that the code is going to production. I don't know. That's something I think interesting for people to think about. Maybe a New Year's resolution in 2021.
That reminds me too of we talked about threat modeling a couple times last year. I think we even did a deep dive on one, and we had a guest. One of the questions was, what's your go-to tool for threat modeling? And the answer was crickets. Nobody had one other than a Google Doc or just a whiteboard or a virtual whiteboard. And I think that it was a perfectly fine answer. The other reason I think that's a great answer, and honestly, that's the answer I would give, is that if we rely too much on the tools, we perhaps diminish some of what the exercise of the skills is in terms of asking the probing questions. If we're just doing a threat model of, how can XSS attack your application? Is your S3 bucket going to be misconfigured? Are you protected against SQL injection? Basically, here's where I'll pick on PCI standard a little bit, because they call out the OWASP top 10 in particular, and that's sort of led, I think, the information security community to build up tools, to build up marketing that is focused on, we scan for the OWASP top 10, as opposed to stepping back and saying, what is the threat modeling approach to these? And so that's kind of how I wanted to take that part of that discussion and say, threat modeling can become tedious, especially if you're trying to do it every consequential change, every single sprint, every 2 weeks. We've got to threat model this. We have to document it. What's the attack? What's this? I'm not quite advocating for that level of rigor there, but just saying, having that idea of where are our trust boundaries, or being able to talk about what happens if we make this change and we introduce a new authorization level, or we now we're going to a new authentication scheme, or we just want to talk about some of the trade-offs between SMS and YubiKeys, and we want to talk about who are we actually protecting rather than the purity of what is the best technical implementation here. And I guess that's where I'm trying to go there, is bringing that user, the idea of the user into the equation as we talk about threat models. So perhaps in that rambling sort of soapbox there, I brought us around to making sure we consider the user and the user experience within these threat models and within security by design. And this is the point where I would poke Matt and wake him up. So I'll go throw it over to you, John. What do you think? Where's your mind right now?
In today's episode, the part by Matt Alderman is playing by. Let's see. Man, I keep having losing thoughts. I'm going to blame the new year. So where I'll bite in on that is the part around how often do we do threat models, and what do we take from that? And I think part of what's interesting to me there is I'd like to see people build up the repetition. Practice to get repetition, so it becomes what do you call it when you have something to do without thinking about it? A mental
like a muscle memory sort of thing.
Thank you, muscle memory. That series of words that obviously this muscle isn't memorizing. But so I think that's it. If you get to the point where it's sort of like I've seen 2 teams now, well 4 teams over the last several years move to Scrum. And it's the first time it was really surprising to me to see not so much the pushback, but if you've been thinking about Scrum for a long time and then seeing a team that's been in a waterfall model actually try to move to it, it's surprising, I think, in a way how much a little bit of pushback, a little bit of old dog new trick type thing.
Change is bad. Yes.
Yeah, but then at the same time, if we can sort of get some of these type of things we've been talking about here for the last half hour into that process, right? When the supreme leader, whoever that person is, actually comes on EDIC with there's a new functionality that needs to be built into your product, what are the steps you need to go through? Okay, well, besides figuring out how in God's name are we going to get this done by this deadline, how do we actually think about getting these things in there into that process? And I think, besides thinking about what specs are there, what code needs to be modified, how do we go test this thing? We need to have documentation. So all these different parts we think about when we're releasing out this product. How's the customer going to use it? What's the user experience going to look like? Maybe what's the malicious user experience going to look like? How do we, not just think positive and in flowers and butterflies, but think about how can we spend at least a few minutes thinking about making sure we're still wearing pants, so to speak. And I think from that point of view, there's definitely value in doing some of these things like the threat model. I mean, I think I happen to, I think last time we had that conversation, I was talking about them, but I didn't have them. But I have now my extra hop threat deck. I found and brought it back out. I don't know if they're still a sponsor, but I still like them. But so, have some sort of thing that makes it fun and engaging, right? It's a form of sales, I think, in a way, which is a lot of what we're doing here, security, when we engage with different people. How do we sort of dangle something to capture people's interest and, be able to, am I going to really start doing cards on air now? But how do we sort of, ruffle cards or get people's attention and say, here, pick one and let's talk about it. And I think it's whether you're using this deck or the Microsoft deck, if that's still around or whatever have you, how do you, there's things that we're going to definitely benefit from doing. Everyone knows we're going to benefit it. So how can you steal just a tiny bit of time to have that quick conversation and get in the door and leave a leaflet behind?
No, I love it. I think one of the aspects that you were showing the extra hop deck, and you alluded to elevation of privilege, the Microsoft version of the same deck, sort of that threat modeling approach, the gamification, and I do love that approach. It's tough to scale well, I'll say off the bat, just because it takes a lot more one-on-one or one to small many type of education and interaction. But I'll throw out there too, for those of you who love RPGs, there's a great RPG called a Cryptomancer. It's basically built around cryptography ideas. Now, it's definitely a bit more of a time investment and much more on the gaming side of things as opposed to threat modeling for products. But I'll throw that out there as something of interest. And as we're maybe coming to a close here for this particular segment, I did want to point out, another way of learning is by imitation, quite honestly, or looking at what are good security by design or what are good design patterns. And we do have, of course, Netflix is famous for having a lot of open source projects that they released to address a particular security problem or a particular engineering problem that they had. So Netflix is a good one to imitate, or just at least go look at, read the source code, learn from what others have done. And there's also the CNCF, so the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. They have various projects. Just one that was was in the news at the end of the year was Argo CD, which is basically talking about ways of just updating how to look and check for inspecting commits and showing that policies are merging to and synchronizing to an approved state. And I'm fumbling on my words here as we're getting to the end. But just highlighting some projects to reference. And I hear you shuffling in the background, John. So maybe you can deal us out at the to the end of this segment.
Yeah, I'm beside being very visual, I'm a fumbler. So once I realized I could pick up the cards and start playing with them, they ended up in my hand. And I had to provide some audio background there for you. Argo is interesting to me. Argo has been on our minds for the last month or two, thinking about both. Do we move to Argo? I've been known to be not a huge fan of Jenkins for the last, I don't know. I refer to it as the cockroach that keeps living. It's still here, and it works. So don't replace it. So I get that, but at the same time, I think in a modern environment like we tend to talk about here with DevSecOps, there's better tools like Argo. If you just want to do the continuous deployment part of things, and that's it. Once you start thinking about the details for folks out there who are thinking about going towards a Kubernetes deployment model, how you do that and how you the intricacies behind doing a new deployment or a rollback or things like that, a modern a CI tool, CD tool like Argo helps a lot with that. So there's value from the Kubernetes side of that, but I think you were focusing more on the, like I said, the post commit side of things as well, which that's interesting. GitHub's doing a lot there. It's interesting. There's a bunch of startups in that space. I'm advising some of them, so I'll keep my mouth shut and not play favorites here. Yeah, and I think if we're going to leave people with a note here on this, it's there's a lot that can be done in this space, but I think you don't have to do all this. If you just take, just one card. Who did I pull? I pulled the cryptocurrency card. But I think if you just pull one card or pull one idea from any of these type of things, I And I don't know what cryptocurrency is going to do with your threat model, but hey, but if you pull one of these ideas and just sort of maybe do one a month, one a quarter, and just put some amount of effort into this, you're moving things forward, right? Don't think from the point of view of, Security Weekly had a great episode. We're going to get to that somewhere around June. Start now. Just do a little tiny baby steps. You don't have to do a lot. Even if it's just a conversation over your Zoom happy hour or something. Get the ball going, and then by the end of the year, you'll have something to be proud of.
I think that's great. Set up some repetition and practice, and that will get to some degree of security by design and exercising that threat modeling. And so that's a good. I'm trying to think of a good outro. I feel like I'm disappointing for the first episode of the year, but you've been dealt a you've been dealt a hand of cards, and it's time to play them. And while John plays his cards, we're going to take a quick break and return with news of the week.